I am going to talk about workers in the wilderness, or how workers are being used today. But as a quick intro, first I'm going to answer a little bit of the question of what are workers. And so first I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about myself. So I've been at Cloudflare for a little bit over 2 years, and most of that time I spent as a solutions engineer. So my parents don't really know what I did, but basically I work with enterprise customers and I help them get set up on Cloudflare. I help during the onboarding process and during the sales process. And so when we launched Workers, it was this really interesting moment where we were super excited, right? Because we played around with it and we're like, we get to run code on the edge. That's what Workers allows you to do. It allows you to run code out of 150 data centers around the world. And you would tell customers this and they would be like, that's so cool. And then they would be like, what can I do with it? And we're like, anything. And they're like, no, but like what? And so we found that it's really helpful to walk through examples of how people are using it, because everyone's like, some people are insanely imaginative. I'm not that creative, so sometimes I draw inspiration from my own customers. But yeah, understanding how people are using it, I think, is really key to actually prodding your own imagination, understanding all the problems that it could solve for you, and all the ways in which it can be used. So I'll start with saying running code is not new, right? Like all of you guys, or a lot of you guys probably write code. You can run it on your laptop. That's cool. You can run code in the browser. That's one place where you can write code, especially if you're a JavaScript developer. That's where the majority of your code runs. You can run code at your origin. So that's those have been traditionally the two places where code exists. So what's the problem with that? Okay, so here the icons might be a little confusing, but the one on the East Coast is the browser and the other one is the origin. So I don't know how many of you guys have been to the East Coast, but a flight to the East Coast is not short, and round trip of request and response is not short either. It might not take 6 hours, but the internet is physical, right? Like it's wires connecting us all together, and so it does take time for your request to travel back and forth between the browser and the origin. And so East Coast, West Coast, not too bad. Especially, most of us are, especially if you live in San Francisco or in the Bay Area, that's where a lot of where cloud infrastructure is. So we're pretty spoiled in terms of how fast our internet really is. But then you get to like, okay, so now we're on the East Coast. What happens if your customers are in Europe? Then every single interaction that you have adds more and more latency, right? So you want to be really even more precious about every request and response that you're forcing to go over the entire internet. And then your company is growing, so you're expanding into India and Australia. My partner used to live there. I joke that his internet must have been really slow. So some other problems that you encounter if you're running code in the browser. So first of all, you don't always have control of the browser. And by that I mean more and more traffic is not interacting with browsers at all, right? Some of it is API traffic that's coming directly from not the browser. Some of it is coming from mobile. A lot of the code that runs in the browser comes from render blocking scripts. So everyone kind of in the JavaScript community is increasingly talking about, why does my page take 6 seconds to load? Like, why is it waiting on all of these resources? Running code at the origins can be hard to update. So especially if you're a provider that provides SDKs to someone that they have to then install on their origin, we have difficulty telling our customers to make the slightest modifications on their origin. Getting someone to run code that you wrote on to run on their origin is even more scary. And similarly, making changes to your own infrastructure can be really scary too. So one example that I really like to use with Workers is how the first use of it, effectively, of how we used it at Cloudflare. So I don't know how much you guys read about what we do, but one of our one of our core missions is to give TLS to everyone and encourage everyone to use TLS where possible. And with that, we obviously want to make sure that everyone is using the latest version of TLS. And so when we were upgrading our API to only allow connections over TLS 1.2, we're initially starting to get our head around how do we do that from our infrastructure. We have all these different services, all these different backends that the API connects to, how we do it all in a uniform way, and how do we do it without breaking anything. And this kind of similarly ties into maintenance and infrastructure costs. So when you have Cloudflare sitting between the end user and your origin, you have this full control to take these decisions over from the origin without having to worry about it breaking. So this is a little bit of an intro, but back to the real world, right? Like, what are people actually doing with workers? So this is kind of an interesting situation that we've encountered as well. So there are two, I think, very different use cases for how workers can be used. And most of the people to hear first about workers were existing customers, right? We have a customer base of around 9 million websites on us. We're like, we released this thing, and everyone's like, how can we use it? And so there are some introductory use cases that might be a little simple, but are still incredibly powerful. So previously, the way that you could control your edge configuration, if you're a Cloudflare customer, especially, some of you might be familiar with this, it's page rules. It's super simplistic, basically actions that you can take on a given URL. So if my URL is X, I want the TTL to be this. I want it to go to this origin. Very kind of simplistic way to configure things. And so often customers would be like, hey, I want to do this based on a header or a country or all these other attributes. And this is something that we had a lot of difficulty with. The other way is with some other providers, you can use VCL, but VCL is very cumbersome. So all this text that's kind of scrolling through, this is like the base configuration. It doesn't actually do very many things. And what I found when I was working with a lot of customers who were transitioning away from VCL is that a lot of them didn't really know what most of it did. So they'd be like, hey, Rita, how do I translate this like header that I'm passing around in every restart? How do I do that in a worker? And you're like, you don't actually have to explicitly do that. It just works. So with workers, you get to write much simpler, much cleaner code that others in your company can also read. So that's another thing that we encountered as we started moving customers away from VCL, is that you actually get yourself into a really dangerous position there. Like, how many of you guys know how to write VCL? How many of you guys know how to write JavaScript? So if the person at your company who is responsible for the VCL configuration leaves, you end up in kind of an uncomfortable situation, which we've seen people end up in. So yeah, much more readable code that you can much more easily control through your CI environment as well. You can actually break it up into like proper functions, write unit tests, etc. So yeah, some basic stuff that we see a lot of customers doing, set cache control headers, set CSP headers, so basically force your site to go to HTTPS. We see a lot of customers setting CORS headers. The other day, someone tweeted at us about how they used workers. They noticed that their hosting provider was occasionally swallowing the content type header, or there was some weird interaction between Cloudflare and the hosting provider, and rather than spending like 20 hours bringing their head against the wall trying to figure out why, you can just use a worker to set that header for you and never have to think about it again. So the next thing kind of is country-based actions. So if you think about it, workers run from basically a few milliseconds away from where your end customer is. So redirects are a really good example that I like to use for why running code so close to your customer is so powerful. So if you think about what a redirect is, all it is you telling a person to go somewhere else, right? So it's basically the browser version of like you going to ask mom and mom telling you go ask dad. But imagine like if mom was in Europe and also then your dad is in Europe, so you're like, stop making me take all these flights. So when you can get the answer of, hey, I'm actually going to send you elsewhere from within 2 milliseconds rather than from 100 milliseconds, that makes a huge difference for performance. The other thing that we can do for you is we can tell you what country your users are coming from. So you can use that to do all sorts of intelligent things, whether you're varying the content that you're presenting to them at the origin or using external APIs to do translation. You can do load balancing, so basically determine which of your web servers you want to send your traffic to based on the country. So the other big topic is protecting and caching private content. So many of the customers that we work with, right, like the way that the internet works is you create some content and you're like, this is really cool, and you initially give it to people for free maybe, and then you start thinking about monetization maybe, and you're like, okay, we have our free content and we have our exclusive content, and we need to be able to protect that exclusive content. So one way to protect that content is by giving out signed requests that you have to have a token to then have access to that content. So we see that with videos, images, HTML. So if you're like a news provider, right, you want to be able to authenticate users and make sure that you can only see this content if you've paid for it. Again, this is not new. You can totally do this at your origin. The problem is that just because I paid to read an article doesn't mean that I'm the only person reading this article. I would imagine a lot of us actually probably have pretty similar taste in the news and articles that we read. So the article that I read, a lot of you guys are going to go and download as well, and you might be subscribers too. So having this single pane of glass where you can do the authentication and caching puts a lot in your control and helps you save a lot too. That's what we're kind of talking about with Have I Been Pwned, right? Serving cache content rather than going back to your origin. And you really start to get into those savings with things like videos that are much more egress consuming. JavaScript packages, NPM is one of our customers, and so they deliver a lot of them. And they're able to basically, for private packages, validate that only those who can view them can then download them. We've even had customers say, hey, you're already caching our videos. What I can do is, instead of differentiating the video at the origin, which means that I never get to cache it, I could sign the first few bytes of it and basically do digital rights management at the edge that way, which I think is really cool. DLP, data loss prevention. So one of the other things that people don't think of in the traditional way of serverless is that where Cloudflare sits is between every request, but also between every response that you send back. So when you think about what a data breach is, it's data that should have never left your infrastructure. Somehow someone found a vulnerability that was able to get them that data to go outside the boundaries of the firewall or of safety. And so since Cloudflare sees every response, you can inspect the response body and either plant canary data at your origin, or we have customers who, for example, if they're serving up social security numbers or credit card numbers, they want to make sure that they're alerted when this happens, and this becoming more and more important, especially as customers are starting to think about things like GDPR. Alert, right? So workers allows you to make several sub-requests on every request. So one of the other things that you can do is, if you detect that there's a data breach, you can make an API call to PagerDuty or Sentry or whatever alerting system you use, and make sure that every single one of these events gets logged in some way or alerted on. A/B testing is another really powerful thing. Back to where I started with with the render blocking scripts, that's what a lot of A/B testing is doing right now, right? And so when you can do it at the edge, you're eliminating that wait time of the script loading. Instead, you can choose at the edge which group you want to send someone to, right? You roll the dice to say, hey, math.random, pick where this person goes. Then the next thing that you want to do is set a cookie to make sure that next time this user comes in, they see the same version, so they have a consistent experience. And then you want to serve the content based on the cookie that you're seeing. Again, if you do this at your origin every single time, you're kind of waiting on that initial request to determine the group and adding more and more of these round trips. Whereas typically with A/B testing, you're A/B testing content. So you're testing, hey, is this color better than this color? Do people click on it more? You can also test other things. You can test backends, right? Like, hey, I'm considering switching to this other backend. Let me put 10% of my traffic on it and see if it's doing any better across all these metrics than the traffic that I had on my previous provider. So why is this important? Again, going back to this diagram, every single decision that you make, we want you to make it really close to your end users. We don't want people waiting on all these requests. And also, selfishly, I'd like to save myself and all of you guys the time of waiting on all these websites and resources to load. So the next thing that we get into is serverless application. So everything we talked about so far is kind of extending the Cloudflare and CDN functionality to allow you to do more things. But you're still kind of maintaining an origin somewhere else. So when I first heard about workers, I played around with it and I was like, oh, it's really cool. I did some of the basic stuff. And then I remember around the holidays, I had a bit more time to sit around and just kind of play with it. So the very first thing that I built with it was breadtime.com, which is a fully serverless application that tells me when Tartine is serving bread. Yeah, it will tell you like, hey, there's like this much time until 4:30, and then it will make an API call to Foursquare to make sure that it's not closed on a given day. And then if it is bread time, you may rejoice. But it goes far beyond that. Obviously, this is a very simplistic application that I built, but you can build much more interesting things on top of workers. So if you go to www.npmjs.com, their entire website is effectively served out of workers. There is no other origin that kind of does this logic. They have their static assets stored somewhere in storage, but they were able to get rid of this whole other layer, right? So previously, you would be like, okay, I have the browser, and then I have the CDN, and then it goes to an Nginx instance that like directs some stuff. You don't need this internal load balancing anymore. You can have workers run all that logic for you. It is fully programmable. So there's really no reason to have redundant infrastructure and have to worry about the cost of it, maintenance of it, and the latency that it's adding. So yeah, serverless. We want you to be running applications directly on the internet. So every single one of these little dots is where Cloudflare currently has a data center. We're continuing to grow. Spoiler alert, we're going to announce 2 more data centers in a couple days. And it's been a running joke for us that like every time we have a number on the slides of how many data centers we have, it's always out of date. But it is really cool, and we're expanding all over the world so that we can serve applications to people much faster, no matter where they are. Thank you.